Technology. There we go. So what is cancer? Cancer is when normal cells multiply and divide in unexpected ways. So it's really a mutation of already existing genes. And at any time in any particular month, most of us have at least some genes that could be, in cells rather, that could be expressed as cancer. But our body normally takes those as debris and moves it out of our system when we have a healthy immune system. So in the absence of outside influences, oftentimes those cancer cells are just moved out of the body by the natural defense systems that we already have. Did you just do that? Yeah. Okay, sorry. I'll give this back to you. Otherwise, I'll think I'm doing it. So this is a really helpful tool to watch for in your own life and in the people that you love, any changes that could be indicators of cancer. And so it uses the word caution, but any change in bowel or bladder habits, a sore that does not heal. And what we mean by does not heal is that it takes more than 3 weeks for a rather superficial something to heal. Sometimes we can have a virus, or we can have a deeper wound that takes longer than that. But for most superficial things, within 3 weeks, we might see just a tiny little scar. Unusual bleeding or discharge, thickening or lump in the breast or elsewhere in the body. It's not just the breast, but in other areas. Ingestion or difficulty in swallowing. So indigestion and any kind of difficulty swallowing it's not related to something you already know you have an issue when you have, say, Brussels sprouts. You always have indigestion, but ongoing indigestion, and anytime you have difficulty swallowing, that's not related to an immediate sore throat or virus that you might be experiencing. An obvious change in a wart or a mole, and a nagging cough or any kind of hoarseness that's ongoing. Again, related to a virus, but as you get better, if it doesn't clear up within 5 to 6 weeks, that's usually kind of the sweet spot for a virus. You want to have it attended to. And those all come from the American Cancer Society. So we can go on to the next one. So what are the facts around cancer? Cancer rates have dropped 33% since the all-time high of cancer in our country, in particular of 1991. Cancer rates have continued to drop. Every year they drop a little bit more, but with the drop of some cancers comes the increase in other kinds of cancers. So one of the kinds of cancers that has kind of the biggest increase right now is skin-related cancer. The non-fatal forms of skin cancer there's been a rise of that. But new cancer diagnosis has also dropped since 1991. So death rates and diagnosis rates have both dropped. Diagnosis rates haven't dropped at 33%, but they have continued to drop year over year. The most common forms of cancer diagnosis already, what we can see for 2023, are going to be breast, lung, prostate, and colorectal. And they all account for about 50% of all cancer diagnosis. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how genes play a role and environment plays a role. But all of these forms of cancer, breast, lung, prostate, and colorectal, have a connection between behavior and cancer diagnosis. And genetics only accounts for about 5 to 10% of all cancer diagnosis. In other words, people who have a predisposition to a particular form of cancer really only accounts for about less than 10%. It's closer to 5% of all cancers that are diagnosed in the United States. And so that when we look at the dropping cancer rates, it's still over 2 million people will be diagnosed with cancer in just this year. Behavior, lifestyle, and environment are the biggest factors contributing to cancer rates, and they're also the biggest factors relating to cancer death rates. So it's not the genetic component that we worry about, it's all of the other things that influence that. So why have cancer rates declined? So the biggest thing is early detection testing. So the advances that we have made in testing and early forms and the education around it, both in general in society, but also from our providers, right? Reminding us we need to get these screenings done and making them routine for everyone has really allowed us to do early detection, and early catches of cancer means that you have a better survival rate and better chances of actually overcoming cancer completely. And new treatments. Those are the two major things that have improved longevity, even for those people who have been diagnosed for cancer. But the biggest thing that has caused cancer diagnosis rates to drop is the reduction in smoking in the United States. So at our high of 1991, prior to all of the things that we have learned about the use of tobacco, whether you were the smoker or you were getting secondhand smoke, both of those things were hugely impactful in cancer rates. Education and awareness, both on a national level, right, direct to consumers, a lot of the things that we did around reducing smoking, getting tested, getting your prostate exams, getting your breast cancer screenings, going and getting your colonoscopy, all of that have made a huge impact. There are some other things that have also changed that are more environmental and not as directly corollary, right? So there's causal and there's corollary in cancer detection. So there have been a lot of work done on removing some of the most toxic elements from our society as far as the day-to-day chemicals that we came in contact with. So things like acid rain that, I lived through the 70s, 80s, and 90s when we still, and not far from here, right? So I lived not that far from here. And you could see during the springtime, your car covered and coated with things that came from the smokestacks of the different companies that generated power or were just running coal as a form of heating used in manufacturing process. All of that has changed. We've changed how the particulate matter that's allowed to come out of smokestacks and be in the general environment for people to breathe in. All of those things collectively have allowed us to continue to see the reduction in chemicals. That doesn't mean that we're perfect, but it means that at the height of chemicals and particulate matter in our environment, the 70s, the 80s, and the early 90s, the changes in regulation have made a huge impact in the quality of the water and the air that we breathe. So go on to the next one. So what are the genetic components? And I think a lot of us think, oh, there's a lot of cancer in my family, there's a family history of cancer, and all of that information is extremely important to share with your general practitioner. But that's not exactly the same thing as having predisposition or a marker for cancer. So the most common genetic mutations that we have heard about are the brachia family of genetic mutations, and these are inherited. So the brachia gene in particular, people from Ashkenazi Jews, people who came from that particular area of the world, there's a stronger correlation to the genetic component, as is people who come from the Mediterranean area. So areas around the Mediterranean. It isn't not an environmental aspect, it is a familial genetic component that was passed along. So brachia 1 and brachia 2 is connected to ovarian cancer, to breast cancer, and to uterine cancer. Those three particular kinds of cancer in women. And they also are usually associated with any men who are diagnosed with breast cancer as well. And brachia 1 and brachia 2 can express itself in men and show up as prostate cancer. It can actually manifest as prostate cancer as well. And so that has to do with a genetic mutation that does not suppress tumor growth. So for most of us, we have healthy immune systems, and we may have cancer or mutated genes in our body that could form into cancer, but we have really strong marshaling forces to take those cells out of our environment. And also if a tumor starts to grow, we have tumor suppressing genes in our body that also suppress them. But for people who have BRCA1, BRCA2, and P53 and TP53, they do not have tumor suppression genetic tools. They don't have that army to suppress tumor development. And then there's HER2 and RAS. They are mutations that cause healthy cells to actually turn into cancer cells. So knowing what your family history is crucial, but understanding the difference between a true genetic variation and a predisposition in your family to actually have cancer are two very different things. And based on your family history and the kinds of cancer and when people got cancer in your family's history, that will help your medical provider know, do we need to do some genetic testing? Or can we actually just use some more intense monitoring? So in my family's history, my niece was diagnosed with a very virulent form of breast cancer at the age of 32, which is very unusual. And so to try to see if there was some genetic variation, she had her gene sequenced and I had my gene sequenced to try to see if we could protect the rest of our family. And neither of us have the BRCA gene. So it was an anomaly that she had it. And the rest of our family at least knows that it is unlikely that we have the BRCA gene in our family. But it also told us that it is easy for us in our environment and behaviors for cancer cells that are mutating to actually turn into full-blown cancer. So knowing your family history, the age at which people got cancer, the form of cancer, and whether that person passed from cancer or not is very, very crucially important. So we talked about how some people can have a genetic predisposition. And that brings up a whole rich science, development of science and research around something called epigenetics. And epigenetics is the science of how behavior and environment turn genes off and on. So when I worked at the Cleveland Clinic, I worked for Dr. Roizen. This was an area of expertise and research that was developed at the Cleveland Clinic and as well as around the world. But this idea that you can turn your genes off and on based on what you do, the foods that you eat, how you manage stress, the quality of your sleep, physical activity. So behavior can make a huge difference, but also environment. So when we talked about some of the reasons why cancer rates have gone down and our understanding of how we put chemicals in the environment, some of us are just more sensitive to some chemicals than others. And some of us are just more sensitive to outside influences than others. In other words, our immune systems aren't very good at fighting off outside invading forces into our body. And so the science and understanding of epigenetics tells us that if we eat better, and we get good quality sleep, and we keep a healthy weight, and we move physically every day, that we are more likely to turn on the genes that kill cancer cells and turn off the genes that actually promote tumor growth. So this study of epigenetics is true for people, the average person who does not have a gene variation, as well as those people who do have a genetic variation. So for people who have the BRCA, women who have the BRCA gene in particular, if they follow good protocol, right? So there's some surgical protocol that can help them reduce their risk, and they can change some of their environment and behaviors, they are less likely to ever manifest the breast, ovarian, and uterine cancer that unfortunately, affects about 40% of people who have the BRCA gene. So they can bring this, in addition to what medical science has to offer, they can do things for themselves that really make a difference. And the understanding of that has helped us understand how we can help everyone be less likely to experience cancer. So epigenetics more, I actually have a whole presentation that I do on that. But environment is key. And we don't really think about this as much because we have done a better job. We have the EPA, we have the environmental movement, the high of, I remember when our river was on fire. That's how old I am. So I was already an adult when our river was on fire. And I remember how that catalyzed not just what we were doing here in Ohio or Northeastern Ohio, but what was happening all over the country. This idea that manufacturing and lots of different things that we were doing were polluting and causing increases in cancer rates all over the country. And we still, unfortunately, are learning these lessons, right? What's happening up in Michigan is still an example. What happened just in East Liverpool area with the train wreck there, the derailment, and how that influenced, and what we're going to be looking at in that community, in those surrounding areas, what's happening in the water, what's happening in the soil, and what's happening for people long term. But we already have made huge strides away from polluting our environment into increasing the quality of the air and the water that we experience. So making sure that you reduce your amount of exposure to toxins. So there's only so much you can do in your environment other than where you choose to live, right? You don't want to live near close to industry, and more communities are being really sensitive to separating where people live and where commerce and manufacturing take place in order to create better environments. But reducing exposure to toxins isn't just about manufacturing, it's about the things that we bring into our homes. So PFAS are what are known as chemicals that'll last forever, right? They're chemicals that don't ever die, they don't decay, they don't break down in the soil. And so making sure that we look at how we're reducing. So when changes were made around plastic manufacturing for things that we ingest, so water, yogurt, all the different kinds of plastic containers, we realized that BPA was really toxic. And so manufacturing rules changed, and you want to have things that are BPA free, but that is still an area that's still transitioning. And so we need to be mindful of not bringing anything with BPA into our environment. And that includes the tickets from fast food restaurants and a lot of stores that have a coating on them that has BPA on it. So reducing the amount of contact that we have, and BPAs aren't just ingested in problems, they're problems from skin contact because the molecules are small enough that they can actually be taken into the body through the skin. So making sure that we're looking at toxins, because toxins, those things in the environment that are not meant to be there, can turn on our cancer and our tumor growth genes and cause us to have a manifestation of cancer. So drinking water is also important. I mean, lots of examples of that all over the country, unfortunately, but making sure that our drinking water is good. And having lived in this area, I know we have good quality drinking water, and I live in Kent now, and we have really good drinking water there, but not everybody does. And we need to be mindful of the water that we ingest and trying to reduce the amount of water that we drink from plastic bottles, even the ones that are BPA free, because research is continuing to find that the plastics in our environment, and even the temporary ones, especially when it's in a hot car and the water hit contact with the plastic, that we're still ingesting more chemicals than we should be. Sun exposure. So sun exposure is a two-sided issue. There's good and bad to sun, right? We get a lot of really great triggering of hormones and information that the body needs from the sun, especially early in the day. It helps connect us to our circadian rhythm. It helps us to get better sleep. It activates vitamin D, especially when we get sunlight on our arms, on our upper chest, and on our thighs in particular. It helps us create vitamin D in the body, and a better quality vitamin D than taking a supplement. Supplementation is only a stopgap measure. It doesn't give you the same robust and really helpful vitamin D that we need. So sun exposure too much is the other side, right? Increasing rates of skin cancer, terminal skin cancer. We're seeing more increasing rates of moles and things that need to be removed from people because they could become much more deadly if they're left unattended to. But sun exposure is those two things, right? A little bit to help build our immune system and give us good quality sleep, but not so much that we get a burn or that we get too much sun exposure. So high noon, you want to avoid high noon, that time from 11 to 1, even if it's a little bit cloudy, is considered kind of the time in which you want to protect yourself from too much sun exposure. Early morning between 7 a.m. and 10 is the sweet spot for just the right amount of sun exposure to get that vitamin D and some other benefits from it. Soil contaminants, and this is something that I talk about in lots of different ways because the soils in the United States have been terribly degraded through 3 different things that we have started in our country. So after World War II, we had a lot of chemicals that were left over, and some really great researchers with wonderful intentions found that it helped certain crops grow and it helped kill some of the things that were eating crops, right? So you couldn't actually get a crop to grow all the way to producing corn or wheat or whatever that we could use. And so they found that some of those chemicals could be put on in such a way that they could kill the invaders and also improve the fertility of the soil enough to feed the explosion of population that we had after World War II, when our troops came back and people started moving on with their life. Soil contaminants did 3 things. They reduced the fertility of the soil. They increased our reliance on these other chemicals. And then those other chemicals continued to degrade the quality of the soil. So you had to keep putting more and more chemicals on the soil and in the crops in order to get them to grow. And so it created a vicious cycle. The idea that they could use some things that were left over for a good purpose turned out to be a negative purpose. So what has happened is not only are there more contaminants in our soil, but plowing of fields has caused the whatever organic material was in there to also leave, as well as minerals. So minerals like magnesium, copper, selenium, manganese, all types of trace minerals that are really helpful for the immune system and the functioning of the body and the brain and our immune system are no longer in the soils for them to be taken up in the fruits and vegetables. So things like magnesium in particular, which is something we're all chronically, most of us are chronically low in, we do not manufacture our own. We have to ingest it through our food. And there is almost no magnesium available in soils. So things that we used to eat like potatoes and squash and some other things that grew, took longer periods and grew closer to the ground or in the ground, no longer actually take up magnesium. And a lack of magnesium means that our immune system doesn't function as well. And a low functioning immune system means that we're more likely to not be able to kick the invaders out of our body, those mutated cancer cells. So soil contamination and poor soil quality are also 2 environmental things that affect our ability to be healthy and to stay cancer-free. And even though smoking rates have dropped from their all-time high of over 40% of adults over the age of 18, to below 20% in our population. But unfortunately, it's rebounded in the last 5 years, and that smoking rates have continued to rise. Back from they're rising back up, not where we were in the 90s and early 2000s, but secondhand smoke and firsthand smoke is very carcinogenic. And so finding ways to make sure you avoid secondhand smoke whenever possible and to make sure that you stay smoke-free. So those are some of the environmental aspects that you want to think about when you think about cancer and increasing cancer rates. So what are the behaviors? What are the things that we do? What are the habits that we do that actually hurt us, that make it more likely that we will either have cancer or that we will have a more deadly form of cancer? And the first and foremost is smoking, which doesn't Doesn't surprise anyone based on the information that we've talked about. So behaviors that hurt: smoking of any kind, vaping, smoking, chewing tobacco, cigars, pipe smoking, all of them have a negative impact. The nicotine is one thing, and then the chemical byproducts are another. And then the deterioration on the lungs in particular, when we bring in those vapors into the lungs. A poor diet, so a diet that is low in fruits and vegetables and whole grains and high in saturated fats, the standard American diet, the SAD diet. Heavily processed, deep fried, unhealthy oils, all of those things also combine, right? The things that we ingest make a huge difference. Our diet is a major generator of the quality of our immune system. So the foods that we bring in on a daily basis really do make a difference at, can you keep your door guarded, right, and secure? Or have you left your door wide open because you're busy, ingesting foods that are unhealthy? Alcohol consumption, and there is lots of controversy around this statement, because some research has shown that a limited amount of alcohol consumption is good for your heart, and it's good for women in particular to prevent dementia and other forms of cognitive decline. But the risk benefit is now being shown that the benefit does not outweigh the risk that alcohol consumption brings into our immune system. And in particular, about 50 to 70% of our immune system resides in our gut, right? So that's an important part of how we keep our doors locked and things at bay, is making sure that our immune system and our gut is functioning at a really high level. And unfortunately, alcohol upsets the balance of the healthy flora that we want to keep in our gut. And so alcohol consumption is being shown to still be a contributor to cancer increase rates. Obesity, and I want to preface this, that it's not just being overweight, it is a preponderance of obesity based on having some of the other poor habits, right? So some of us can naturally be overweight or even be considered obese and not be obese, right? Not actually have all of the metabolic issues related to obesity. And the reminder that skinny people drop dead every day too. And skinny people get cancer every day. That it's the obesity that is brought on by all of the other behaviors that are known to be unhealthy: not moving, eating really unhealthy foods, smoking, and also not getting good quality sleep. All of those things, obesity is shown to be a direct corollary to cancer, not necessarily causal. But if you are obese and doing all of these other things, it's such a strain on our system when we are overweight or obese. The strain on our immune system, the strain on our heart, the strain on our liver, the strain on our lungs is immense. And a strained system isn't good at fighting off invaders. Sun exposure, so that mindfulness around the 11 to 1 time period in particular. And then being physically inactive. We all know this, right? We don't feel as good when we don't move, and our body doesn't function as well when we don't move. And we have higher stress levels when we're physically inactive. And we know that stress is also related to cancer as well. So now that we've talked about all the negative things, let's talk about things that heal. So here's the great news. Even if you're a smoker, if you quit smoking now, in about 7 years for the average person, you will regain the non-smoker related percentage of actually having cancer, right? You can repair, if you do it well, you can repair the lungs over the course of 7 years. So not smoking can be turned around. For some people, the damage is so deep, right? So if you've been smoking for 70 years and you've stopped smoking, it's not going to happen in 7 years. It may never happen for you. The damage might be terminal. But in general, if you quit smoking, you can regain good lung function and return to that percentage of the general population as far as risk is concerned. Healthy diet, over and over and over, we talk about this. All those things that we bring in that our body needs to be healthy and strong and vital and have a great functioning immune system and have a really good functioning gut, diet is the key. And so there's research to show that for people who are recovering from cancer, even really serious things like pancreatic cancer, which has a really high mortality rate, that if they eat a healthier diet, they feel better, their immune system functions better, and while they may never recover from their cancer, their quality of life improves. So eating a healthy diet helps at all stages and is really important. And it's probably the number one thing that if everybody's been to the sessions that we've been having, it's probably the thing we talk about the most: exercise and healthy eating. And exercise, of course, is the next one. So there was a great research study done in the early 2000s that showed that women who had breast cancer, not a brachia related, but just breast cancer in general, that if they went on a Mediterranean-based diet, so high in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and low in fried things and unhealthy fats, and exercised a minimum of 30 minutes, 5 days a week, that their instance of recovery and a secondary diagnosis of breast cancer or a recurrence of breast cancer dropped by 50%. Just those two things: physical activity and a better diet. So exercise is hugely impactful. It doesn't mean you have to go to a gym and lift weights for 45 minutes or 2 hours or take a high-end aerobics class. They found that walking and strength building, those two things together, 30 minutes, 5 days a week, is the baseline for turning things around. Getting your screenings, and this goes back to why we saw cancer rates drop, is because more people got screened. Doctors got better about talking to their patients about it. It became very routine that if you went in, you got blood work, you got a colonoscopy, depending on your age and your risk factor, you got a prostate exam, you went and you got your pap smear. All of those things happen very routinely now, and they didn't before the 1990s. It was not routine to do that. And I know because I was diagnosed with cancer in the 90s, and it was right at that point becoming more routine. And I had missed hearing that I had a bad test. And then a year later, I came back in and they're like, "Oh my God, you had a bad test. What happened? Why didn't you come back in?" And I was like, I didn't know. And then all of a sudden I had cancer. And so they had a really great treatment and process to get me through so that now I have a normal lifespan. So all of those advances make a huge difference. Getting your screening, following up on anything that your doctor talks about, as well as staying on top of whatever your risk factors are. And sun protection, which we've talked over and over. And that we emphasize sun protection in particular because of the increase of skin cancer rates. So what are the healthiest habits? And again, I'm repeating some things here and for good reason, because cancer is a horrible, horrible disease. And the interesting thing is that a lot of cancers that were a death sentence back in the 50s and 60s are now treated as a chronic condition. Things like leukemia, right? So I had a brother who passed away at the age of 5 from leukemia, and his leukemia 10 years after he died there was a 20% there was a 20% decrease in mortality. And by the time I was 15 or 16 years old, it was almost a 90% survival rate. So healthy habits and things change so frequently, right? So staying and breathing free is the number one thing. And what I mean by that is not smoking, not vaping. I worked at a university and I would constantly have discussions with the students about vaping. And I'm like, oh my gosh, and they're like, oh, but you don't get the same hit of nicotine. I'm like, nicotine isn't necessarily the problem. You actually have twice as many chemicals in your vaping as there were in cigarettes 10 years ago. And those are the things that you need to be concerned about. And they're doing things in your body that you may not notice in the next year, But 10 years from now, you keep it up and you've created a habit that's creating ripe conditions for things like cancer. Be more active, eat more plants. And I love making it simple, right? I don't like really complicated diets. I think it's really hard for a lot of people to change and to be able to make that a permanent change. But just the idea of eating more plants, that when you put things on your plate to eat, think in terms of plants, salads, greens, vegetables, fruits. And then the things that you put on top of it, let them be things that make you feel good, or they're, you know, super tasty and that give you comfort, or remind you of something in particular about your childhood, whatever it might be. But if you make the focus on every plate that you eat, every meal that you eat, to make sure plants form the basic foundation, then you can put other things on top in limited quantity. And the good thing is that plants take a lot of work to ingest, and they fill us up full pretty quickly. Avoiding alcohol. And then again, that's kind of a sticky one, but I'm going to go with it because I think that it's true. And I have done my best to limit alcohol in my life. And I have other friends. I have a wide group of female friends. And out of my 20 closest female friends, only one has not had breast cancer. And that's me. So limiting alcohol, avoiding alcohol, and limiting caffeine. And this is something we didn't talk about. And again, this can be controversial because there are some good research studies. Again, alcohol and caffeine. Caffeine can be good for dementia, right? It can be good for staving off dementia. So it's not always the caffeine. The caffeine isn't the problem. It's the chemicals that are used in the manufacturing of coffee. And unfortunately, there is a mold that is on most of the coffee beans that we get, and they're finding that that is actually a toxin as well. So watching your weight, making sure that you don't allow obesity or really high weight to impact your ability to move or eat well, and then stand more. So we sit an awful lot, right? We sit all the time. And if we stand more, the research is pretty compelling that if you get up and you stand more throughout the day, and putting things like an anti-stress mat underneath your feet when you're standing, maybe have a standing desk, and it doesn't have to be elaborate. I have a box, just a plain old Amazon box, and I put my computer on top of the box and I'll stand for a while and do that. Sometimes I'll sit on an exercise ball, whatever it is to get up and move more. But standing burns more calories than sitting. And there is a metabolic trigger from standing that fires up the system that sitting turns off. And managing stress, very, very important. So some research was done for prostate and breast cancer survivors, a longitudinal study that goes 30 years, that people who ate more of a plant-based diet, they didn't become vegans or vegetarians, they ate more of a plant-based diet, and there's some specifics around that. They did 30 minutes of physical activity 5 times a week, and they meditated 3 times a week for 10 minutes. And those 3 things together reduced their overall recurrence of a secondary occurrence of cancer, or it prevented them from it getting worse, right? So some forms of cancer are now treated as a chronic condition as opposed to a terminal illness or a acute illness. And so managing your stress can be extremely impactful at making sure that the chronic doesn't turn back into acute. So healthy habits that make a difference. Here are some wonderful, great, robust resources for digging deeper. And all of us know someone who's had cancer, right? Everybody knows someone who's had cancer or who maybe has passed from cancer. We can't get away from it. It's a part of our culture now. There are cultures in the world, both what we would consider developed and undeveloped, that do not have cancer at the rates that we do. And so you can't say that in a room with people from that culture because they don't have that experience. But for us It is an overwhelming issue in society. Cancer rates dropped during the pandemic. Can you imagine why they dropped? No, that's unfortunately not why. It's just because they didn't get diagnosed. They had cancer, diagnosis rates dropped, and then there was a bump in the 18 months after the pandemic, and it was easier to get in and see your doc. The diagnosis rates increased to the normal level. And it was just because people didn't go to the doctor, right? They didn't find out they had colon cancer. They didn't find out they had prostate cancer. And so we will see over the next 10 years, probably a higher mortality rate for some of those people because they didn't have that early treatment. But these resources are really robust, lots of things that you can go deeper into the information. And I just want to take a break and see if you have questions or thoughts or comments. I really encourage any of my clients to use stainless steel. Yeah, I mean, I drink out of a plastic bottle too, but there's different grades of plastic, and the thicker, the heavier it is, the less likely it is to have so many chemicals. The chemicals are what keep those things stable. The thinner the plastic, the more chemicals to keep it stable. The thicker the plastic, the less chemicals they need, because the physical product is all that is necessary to keep the shape. But stainless steel, glass, glass with maybe a rubber coating over it so it doesn't break. Those are really our recommendation. And to get away from drinking water out of bottles. I mean, it's crazy how much money we spend, how much garbage we generate, how many more plastics we put into the environment that break down and then end up in our system. So that, autopsies that were done on young people 30 years ago, or I'd have to go back further, 40 years ago, the rates of plastics that they found in their body were extremely low. And today, almost every single child that ever has an autopsy has high rates when they check for it of what are known as PFAS, these eternal chemicals that just don't break down. They're absorbed into the body. Our body doesn't break them down. The environment doesn't break them down. They're here with us forever. So these are really important resources. Yeah. Don't mean to freak you out over that, but the good thing is that when we can reduce our amount of stress or our own concern over getting cancer if we take those steps, right? We eat a better diet, we move, we get better sleep, we go get our testing, we deal with things quickly as they come up. We are conscious of our environment, the things that we're around, people that live, unfortunately, people who live in cities close to manufacturing where water and soil and air are already really impacted and have lower access to good quality healthcare. They might be financially struggling. All of those people have higher cancer rates than the average person because the environment and their access to that good quality food or clean air and good quality care, which are the recipe for helping us either stave off cancer or recover from it, is not as accessible to that community. So great resources there, but any questions or thoughts? Yes, it is. So that's how you reach me. Yeah. Growing in my soil that I learned about how to add minerals back into my soil. And so that I've been actually doing research on the soils with the Ohio State Extension to see if I can actually build up the quality of the soil and have it impact the quality of the food. So potatoes is a perfect one, although you can see a green one and you don't ever want to eat green potatoes. It just means that it was exposed to air. But potatoes are the Irish, basically subsisted on potatoes. It was an important part of their diet. And that's why when the potato blight happened, there was such devastation and starvation in Ireland. But they had low rates of cancer, especially colorectal cancer, stomach cancer related to digestion, because potatoes are rich in all kinds of trace minerals because they're in the ground like carrots, but longer. potatoes are in the ground longer and they come in contact with, not directly the minerals, because that's not how we get things into our food. It's the critters that in the soil that break down the minerals, and then they excrete things, and that's what's taken up by our fruits and vegetables. So I'm, doing research on, well, I'm not doing research. I'm just providing samples for the soil to see if we can improve that. Other questions, comments? The good thing is cancer rates are dropping. Quality of treatment is improving. Lifespans are still improving. So the kind of cancer that I was diagnosed with, it had pretty low mortality rates anyway, but it's almost completely curable today, 25 years after I was first diagnosed, almost 30 years after I was first diagnosed. Questions? Okay, thank you so much. Thanks. I hope that it's helpful in the recorded version, and there's some questions for people to answer. And I think, Lily, I'm pretty sure I covered every single question in detail that I asked. Yeah, no, I did.